Let's examine some of the alignment options for pivots. I'll start by affecting the object only, and then I'll align the object to the world by clicking this button. That rotates the table so that it's parallel to the home grid. Notice that the pivot point remains rotated, oblique to the grid. I'll affect the pivot only, and then I can align the pivot to either the object or world. They're identical in this case. Finally, I'll center the pivot to the object by clicking here. And the pivot moves to the center of the volume defined by the bounding box. So it's floating some distance below the table, as you can see here. This is not ideal. Think of the pivot point as the insertion point of this object if you're used to AutoCAD. When you bring this object into another scene, it's going to appear at its pivot point. And you don't want that point to be floating here because that would end up with the table legs sticking through the floor. So I strongly advise you to pay attention to where the pivot point is when you're designing objects like pieces of furniture. It makes sense to either center the pivot point on the object or perhaps move it to some edge or vertex. By the way, you can snap to pivot points. So in the case of this table, the ideal location for its pivot point would be centered on the tabletop, but on the ground. So I'd like to move the pivot point down. While I'm still in Affect Pivot Only mode, and I'm in the Move tool, I'll go down here and right-click on the Z spinner to set its value to 0, and that moves the pivot right down onto the ground. Now I'll exit this mode, and we can save the file. It's good for use in other scenes at this point.